straight upwards. But in this dissection, the one we'll be following, it takes quite a forward curve. The branches of the external carotid arteries supply the skull, the dura, and all of the head outside the cranial cavity, apart from the orbit. The brain is supplied by the internal carotid arteries and the vertebral arteries. We'll move on now to follow those arteries into the cranium and look at their branches. To follow the internal carotid artery, we'll take the external carotid and its branches out of the picture. We'll also remove the posterior belly of the digastric, the styloid process, and the muscles that arise from it. The internal carotid artery runs upwards to the base of the skull without branching. The internal jugular vein is lateral to it, here. The internal carotid artery enters the carotid canal, which is here in the dry skull. The carotid canal immediately turns to run forwards and medially. To see the other end of the carotid canal, we'll go all the way round to the inside. The carotid canal comes from this direction and ends here at the foramen lacerum. To expose the internal carotid, we'll first remove the dura of the middle cranial fossa. Then we'll remove this structure, the trigeminal ganglion, and finally these three cranial nerves, the third, fourth, and sixth. Here's the internal carotid artery coming up out of the foramen lacerum. The internal carotid artery here lies within an irregular cavity, the cavernous sinus, that's a passageway for venous blood. We'll see it later in this section. The artery turns to run forwards and then makes a complete 180-degree turn. This turn takes it under the anterior clinoid process and brings it out here, just below and behind the optic canal. The internal carotid artery finally emerges through the dura, just beneath the optic nerve. As it completes its backward turn, it gives off a branch, the ophthalmic artery. To see that, we'll remove the optic nerve and the dura beneath it. Here's the start of the ophthalmic artery. It runs forwards into the optic canal, along with the optic nerve. The ophthalmic artery supplies the contents of the orbit and continues forward to supply the central part of the forehead. To see how the internal carotid artery ends, we'll add its last part and the optic chiasm to the picture. The internal carotid artery ends by emerging from beneath the chiasm, curving laterally as it does so. We'll follow its branches in a minute. Now we'll follow the course of the other major artery to the brain, the vertebral artery. As we've seen, the vertebral artery arises from the subclavian artery in the root of the neck. It runs straight upwards and disappears to pass through the opening in the transverse process of the sixth cervical vertebra. To follow its course, we'll remove all the neck muscles and the tissues between the transverse processes. The vertebral artery runs upwards through the transverse processes of the upper six cervical vertebrae. Here's the vertebral artery. The two vertebral arteries pass through these openings in each vertebra. After passing through the transverse process of the atlas, the artery turns backwards and then medially to pass through the atlanto-occipital membrane and the dura just below the foramen magnum, which is here. To follow the vertebral artery, we'll divide the cranium along this line and remove the brain. Here are the two vertebral arteries passing through the dura. The vertebral arteries join together, forming this large artery, the basilar artery, which runs upwards and forwards above and behind the basilar part of the occipital bone. Now that we've followed the internal carotid and vertebral arteries into the cranial cavity, we'll see how they supply the brain. We'll also see the set of arterial connections known as the arterial circle or circle of Willis. So far, we've seen the internal carotids entering up here, the vertebral arteries entering down here and joining to form the basilar artery. Now, we'll complete the picture. To name the vessels we're looking at, we'll start with the main branches of the internal carotid. The internal carotid gives off the anterior cerebral and posterior communicating arteries, then continues with a different name. From here, the vessel is called the middle cerebral artery. The two anterior cerebral arteries curve towards each other above the chiasm, then pass upwards and forwards, close together, to enter the longitudinal cerebral fissure between the two cerebral hemispheres. Just above the optic chiasm, the two anterior cerebral arteries are connected to each other by this very short anterior communicating artery, which is part of the arterial circle. The middle cerebral artery, which is the direct continuation of the internal carotid, curves laterally. It enters the lateral cerebral fissure between the frontal and temporal lobes. We'll follow it there shortly. The pale areas on this artery are patches of atheroma. Now we'll go round to a view from behind to see the vertebral and basilar arteries and the vessels that arise from them. Here are the two vertebral arteries joining together to form the basilar artery. Down here, four inferior cerebellar arteries usually arise, two posterior and two anterior. These are the posterior ones. In this specimen, the anterior ones are represented by this one vessel. In addition, the basilar artery gives off small branches to the pons and this labyrinthine artery that supplies the inner ear. Four branches arise from the top of the basilar artery, these two superior cerebellar arteries, and the two terminal branches of the basilar, the posterior cerebral arteries. The posterior cerebral artery curves backwards and laterally above this nerve, the oculomotor. It curls around the cerebral peduncle. We'll look at its course in a few minutes. Just as it turns, the posterior cerebral artery is joined by this small artery that we've seen already, the posterior communicating artery. The posterior communicating artery completes the arterial circle. The arterial circle provides connections between the right and left sides and also connects the vertebral and internal carotid systems. It's more of a hexagon than a circle. Its component parts, from front to back, are the anterior communicating artery, the anterior cerebral arteries, the internal carotids, the posterior communicating arteries, and the posterior cerebral arteries. The arrangement is often somewhat asymmetrical. Here, the left posterior communicating artery is very small. The vessels we're looking at lie in the confined space between the floor of the cranial cavity and the underside of the brain. To see how they're related to the brain, we'll look at a brain that's been removed from the body together with its arteries. The arteries have been filled with red latex. Over this area, the arachnoid layer and the many small vessels in it have been removed so that we can see the major arteries. Here's the optic chiasm. Here beneath it are the divided ends of the internal carotid arteries. Here's the anterior cerebral artery passing around the optic chiasm, which will pull downwards. Here's the anterior communicating artery. The two anterior cerebral arteries turn upwards to enter the longitudinal cerebral fissure. We'll follow them shortly. The internal carotid, which we'll go back to, gives off the posterior communicating artery, then continues to become the middle cerebral artery. The middle cerebral artery enters the lateral cerebral fissure between the frontal and temporal lobes of the cerebral hemisphere. Coming from below, Here are the two vertebral arteries joining to form the basilar artery, which is quite off-center in this specimen. Here are three of the possible four inferior cerebellar arteries. Here are the two superior cerebellar arteries. Here's the division of the basilar into the two posterior cerebral arteries. To follow the course of the anterior, middle, and posterior cerebral arteries, we'll divide the brain in the midline and look at just one cerebral hemisphere. Each anterior cerebral artery runs upwards and then backwards, close to the corpus callosum. It gives off branches which supply this area on the medial aspect of the cerebral hemisphere, and which then reach over the superior margin of the hemisphere to supply this area on the lateral aspect. Next we'll follow the middle cerebral artery. Here it is again, running in the depths of the lateral cerebral fissure. The middle cerebral artery gives off branches which emerge along the length of the lateral cerebral fissure to supply this area on the lateral aspect of the cerebral hemisphere. Lastly, we'll follow the posterior cerebral artery. It runs laterally, just above this nerve, the oculomotor, then runs backward, passing around the cerebral peduncle. To follow it, we'll again look at the cerebral hemisphere by itself. Here's the posterior cerebral artery. It winds around between the cerebral peduncle, which has been divided here, and the most medial part of the temporal lobe. The posterior cerebral artery gives off branches which supply this area on the medial aspect and underside of the hemisphere, and this aspect on the lateral aspect.